Welcome to episode 249 of the 6G podcast. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 6G and 5G. We cover about six topics in roughly 30 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Anshul Sag, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Mike Dano from Ookla. Hey, Mike, how's it going?
Pretty good, pretty good. Weather this weekend looks here in Denver looks nice and sunny, so I'm ready. I'm
Not that
ready for a
blizzard
nice.
conditions you had.
Yeah. We had a huge spring storm, which is somewhat common, but mountains got a ton of snow, cold and rainy during the city the whole week. So we've got a real nice weekend ahead of us now. So uh, anytime the weather gets sunny, my mood improves dramatically. So I'm looking forward to it. How about you? Yeah, you've had a trip to the zoo today.
Yes, I was at the zoo this morning. The weather was great. Um, Got to see the new elephant enclosure at the San Diego Zoo Safari Park, which is incredible. They really designed it so you can get really close to the elephants, but like at a safe distance. And yeah, I took a call from the elephant enclosure, which was interesting and nice. And yeah, most of this week I traveled. One of the topics that I've got is part of that. But yeah, the next week I'm not traveling, which is nice. Um, but lots of stuff coming up in May, and we'll have lots to talk about.
It's a busy month. I'm looking forward to some downtime tomorrow because I think all if your May is like my May, it's a busy month.
And it is the 1st of May, so it's no longer gonna be May. It is May,
It is
and
May.
that means the May the 4th is coming soon.
That's right. I know. I actually have a presentation on May the 4th, and my first slide is AI, Han Solo, and Luke Skywalker, because I feel like you have to mention the fact that May the Fourth be with you. That's an important day in the calendar. Second only to Free Comic Book Day, which is actually later this month.
I didn't even know that was a thing.
Oh yeah. Check out your local comic book shop. Free Comic Book Day is a it's just right below Christmas at our house, at least for
Very cool.
me. Actually, none of the rest of the family cares about it at all. I'm the only one who cares about Free Comic Book Day, but I care about it a lot.
Good to know.
Hmm.
All right. Well, I will kick things off with my first topic. And I'm sure you saw this. T-Mobile launched what they call Super Broadband, which sounds ridiculous until you realize they already have a Super Mobile. Um, but it is actually a very interesting offering. The reason why I like it is one, it takes T-Mobile's 5G network and pairs it with SpaceX's Starlink, and they do this in a way that is flexible and satisfies different types of users. So, one, it can be used as a fallback connection for your fiber. So, like, let's say you have fiber, this can be your a backup with another backup behind it, so you can have dual backups or double redundancy. You can also use this as your primary internet connection with 5G as your primary link and satellite as your backup, or you can use satellite and 5G together and load balance across them depending on the application and the workload and whether or not it's latency sensitive. And yeah, I think the other thing that makes it really interesting is one, it's a tier one operator offering such a solution. And two, they're offering it through multiple infrastructure providers, namely Ericsson and Inseego. What I did learn is that Inseego is kind of the fast follow option behind Ericsson. So Ericsson's kind of providing the high end solution while Inseego is offering kind of the entry level and the mid range. And Ericsson is also, they're going to be the launch partner. So their equipment, I think it's the E3000 router, is kind of the basis of this launch. And obviously, with the optional radio attachment, you can get better speeds on 5G. And you do need a Starlink terminal as part of the solution. But also, what I think is awesome about it is, yes, it is $249 a month, which is not cheap, but it includes all the equipment and the data and the installation and customer service. So it's like the whole solution is nicely packaged up as one, and that includes the manageability software that the manufacturers are providing through T-Mobile. So like T-Mobile's the actual handling of all this. So the customer is pretty much, oblivious to who the infrastructure provider is or how it's configured. It's really just to their preferences and their needs. And there will be faster, or not faster, there will be more high-end offerings beyond this $249. So there will be more tiers. But I just think it's really interesting that they've gone with such a tightly coupled solution that's kind of like a one-stop shop. And I like that because I think a lot of businesses want to simplify their connection solutions, especially if they need to have this kind of backup solution in more than one location, and not wanting to have to deal with multiple providers. And yeah, I just think that this is like the right solution. And as someone who had two parents who used to own their own businesses, I was the one who set up their internet for their businesses. And I remember it being so angry at the choices that they had, but also how much they cost and how terrible they were. So I think this will potentially create an alternative offering to what a lot of people are stuck with. And I'm hoping to see that this is another growth opportunity for T-Mobile, but also Ericsson and Inseego, who, you know, they offer a lot of products and services, but none of them are, you know, front and center in front of the customer like T-Mobile is. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts and if you had any opinions.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I did see that headline, and I was glad to see that you were going to dig into it, because I actually didn't know a whole lot about it. So yeah, that is interesting, and I think it, in my mind, it dovetails a lot with stuff that we have talked about in the past, such as, Charter and several other cable companies have been installing 5G backup into their Wi-Fi routers. So if the wired network goes down, you would have a backup, 5G backup at the router level that would keep you on the internet. And this sort of falls along in that same category as, like, primary service, secondary service, automatic backup. And my colleague here at Ookla, Carrie Baker, predicted this as resiliency as convergence. That was how he phrased that kind of this mixing of telecom services, where you mix wireless, wireline, you mix wireless and satellite. The name that he gave to this product category is resiliency as convergence, and I think that's a fair takeaway. And so, are you getting a sense of, like, how much demand there is for this kind of thing? I'm assuming it's not super broad based, but there's definitely, like you said, there's some demand for it, particularly among enterprise.
Yeah, I think this is definitely one of those things where it's like, I think the market's bigger than we realize, but I also think that, like, there's different types of customers. Like, if there's one customer that's just like a huge corporation, like Shell, for example, who's a customer that they had on stage, they have gas stations everywhere, right? Like, I can imagine that they don't want that ever going offline, and they've got probably tons of gas stations that have pretty spotty signal as it is already. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to talk to businesses and their need to stay online as more and more of their businesses become connected. And like, if they lose internet for an hour or even a day, like, that could be catastrophic as a loss. So being able to have this as a service, as a backup, and having, knowing that $250 a month, you have a peace of mind that you're always going to have internet. And they're offering 4 nines of reliability, so 99.99%, which I think they said is something like 5 minutes of downtime per year, something like that.
Yeah, just enough. Yeah, interesting stuff. And so actually, this dovetails very closely into the thing that I want to talk about first, which is also about T-Mobile, also about convergence, but from the perspective of wireless and fiber convergence. And so also this week we had T-Mobile's earnings, but T-Mobile also announced new deals to acquire additional smaller fiber providers. So the announcement that T-Mobile came up with, and this follows along in the same exact footsteps of their previous agreements to acquire, I think it was Lumos and Metronet fiber networks in parts of the US. They have some new agreements with some private equity to acquire Go NetSpeed, Greenlight Networks, and i3 Broadband, which are all sort of, smaller regional fiber providers And so T-Mobile is essentially adding those fiber providers into their existing fiber footprint. And I think the goal here, I'm going to look it up. The goal here is ultimately to expand um, their total broadband footprint to 18 to 19 million total customers by 2030, including 3 to 4 million fiber customers by 2030. So, it's definitely not a nationwide play, but it certainly expands and sort of firms up, the T-Mobile fiber strategy. But there's still a couple of interesting elements within this announcement. I mean, it's certainly worth watching. It is definitely not nationwide in scale, and is smaller than the fiber ambitions of AT&T and Verizon. But I think there's a lot kind of to digest with this announcement. A couple things I'd highlight. One is that, so the question here is uh, well, let's see. I guess the first thing I would highlight is um, that I looked at the Ookla speed tests for Go Net Speed, i3 Broadband, and Greenlight Networks. These are the three fiber operators that T-Mobile is acquiring, and I don't think it's any surprise. All three of those providers have they provide very fast networks. So the aggregate median download speeds are all for all of those providers are pretty well above the sort of the benchmark that is provided by all U.S. broadband providers. So they're well above 300 megabytes a second in the month of March, which I don't think is really a surprise. But then another interesting thing is that concurrent with this, according to the website T-Mo report, which is a great source of interesting T-Mobile information. According to that one, T-Mobile is getting ready to change the pricing of its T-Mobile fiber service and is essentially lowering some prices on some plans. So the 500 megabytes per second plan is being removed. It's being replaced by a 300 megabyte per second plan at a slightly lower cost. And then the 1 gigabyte plan is getting a slight price reduction. So essentially what we're seeing is sort of a maturation of T-Mobile's T-Mobile fiber business, expanding the footprint, inking new joint ventures in order to expand the footprint, and then also adjusting pricing. And I think here, the big takeaway here is, to what end? Why is T-Mobile pursuing this fiber stuff? Well, recently our good friend Roger Entner at Recon Analytics put out a real interesting report this week about sort of the numbers behind convergence, and what he reported was that if you look at AT&T, which has a pretty substantial fiber footprint, in locations where AT&T does not offer a wireline option, the market share is about 14%, and in locations where T-Mobile does have a pretty substantial wired footprint, its wireless market share goes almost up to 30%. And so his takeaway is that, again, in locations where you can offer both wired and wireless options, the result is that you have an overall boost in your market share. And so I think, certainly that would underscore, the moves by T-Mobile, but I think the final thing here is that right now T-Mobile is not yet offering any major converged. It does not have any major promotional offers in terms of converged services for T-Mobile fiber and its wireless service. I think that may be coming at some point in the future. And all this continues to stoke speculation as to whether there's a major merger or acquisition that could play out this year. I know a lot of people have talked about whether T-Mobile will make a play to acquire Charter. That is a topic that has been a big topic of discussion among financial analysts for probably more than a year now. Whether T-Mobile will make a bid to acquire Charter, and at least according to the folks over at New Street Research, the new agreements this week, the fiber deals that T-Mobile announced, they said that it certainly doesn't close the door on a potential T-Mobile a transaction with Charter or Comcast, but it does decrease the odds. It certainly indicates that T-Mobile is interested in a pure play fiber provider like these ones that has recently agreed to acquire versus a cable company. Pure fiber. So, a lot of interesting movements there. I think it does dovetail with this, with broadband, it's an expansion of the internet offerings that Nokia has, whether it's wireless, whether it's satellite, whether it's fiber. Um, this does certainly feel like the future, right? These kinds of converged services, multiple offerings across different technologies, blending those kinds of services together. And this seems to be
Great. I don't really have that much to add, to be perfectly honest with you. I think you did a very good job. Um, I do think that it's interesting to see fiber kind of continuing to grow in relevance. Did find that statistic about AT&T's subscribers for wireless being affected by its fiber connections. Um, I think that makes a lot of sense when you consider the whole bundling deals that they offer. I think everybody wants to offer bundles because it causes more stickiness. And yeah, I think we're going to see everybody continue to expand fiber, which I wholly agree on. And you know, uh, I don't think that there's a lot of interest to keep growing copper. So it seems like fiber is really the only path
yeah.
for, you know, like we talked last week. It's like kind of the only real path forward. So I think T-Mobile gets it. Um, but yeah, I don't really have much else to add. So I'll move on to my second topic,
Yeah.
which is a gigantic one. Um, there were a lot of tech earnings this week. So I'm going to make this really quick and not waste anybody's time. Um, Google announced their earnings, which were very strong. Cloud was huge for them and profitability. Um, and Microsoft also showed very strong cloud growth. They struggled with gaming and Windows. And they've actually been announcing a lot of projects to improve the Windows experience, which seems like something that they've already been working on. And it clearly shows that their growth is stalling there. So they need to make some serious moves, which they already have. In the Xbox division, they've kind of wound back some of their previous decisions that people were unhappy with. So maybe they're learning their lesson. Meta reported its fastest revenue expansion in years, driven by its ad momentum, but they also increased a significant amount of their capex, and that their revenue outlook is not as great, so they got hammered. And then Qualcomm also announced earnings, which were impacted by the memory supply constraints. So that was down in terms of smartphone volumes, but the stock still rebounded because auto did really well, and they announced that they have a custom silicon partnership with a cloud provider, which jumped their stock like 15%, even though earnings were expected almost. And then last but not least was Apple. And Apple had an incredible quarter. And they specifically announced that they're doing really well in China, rebounding actually from where they got hit really hard in the past. I will say China's a very cyclical market for Apple and can swing wildly in either direction for them. They obviously talked about John Turnus taking over as CEO, and they said that they were really surprised by all of the demand for Mac Minis and Mac Studios for AI, and they said that it's going to be months before those are restocked. And I just saw an article that they discontinued the entry level model, so there's clearly a lot of demand for that. And in general, things are doing pretty well for Apple as a company. Um, and Mac continues to grow. And I think we're going to see Mac grow even more with the Mac Neo, especially as we near the um, back to school season in late summer. And I think they're going to post some of the most incredible Mac numbers I think maybe we've ever seen, because it's such a low end product that it's going to drive volumes like crazy. And there's going to be a lot more people who can afford one because of that student discount. So, you know, a $499 PC is generally a piece of crap unless it's a Mac Neo. But what's interesting is that Intel has announced the processor that's competitive with the Mac Neo, and it's really up to OEMs to be able to take advantage of that chip to compete with the Mac Neo. And we might actually see some really compelling low-cost PCs in the second half of this year, thanks to the pressure that the Mac Neo is putting on the PC industry. And yeah, overall, most of the AI cloud providers are actually doing pretty well. You know, I would say, you know, Microsoft had a renewed agreement with OpenAI that gave OpenAI access to more cloud providers like AWS. And in general, it's just like CapEx is up and up and up and up. And, you know, we're going to see hundreds of billions of dollars invested in AI infrastructure this year. And there's just a lot of demand for it. So I don't see this trend necessarily changing anytime soon unless we see some real economic headwinds, which might come as a consequence of the whole Strait of Hormuz situation with Iran. But you know, I've looked into the data, and it takes 6 months after things have settled down for the economy to actually feel the impact. So we might not actually see this for some time. And yeah, I think a lot of this AI infrastructure is also going to be really valuable in enabling 6G. So I think we're going to get to the point where some of this AI infrastructure starts powering cellular networks. And I just think right now it's very cloud focused, but it won't be forever.
Yeah, great point to tie it back to 6G. That's a good point. Are you? I'm thinking of like kind of Apple and Qualcomm specifically. I think that they didn't really talk much about component shortages from like the memory components and how those it's hard to get those components because of all the demand for AI. You don't see
Qualcomm
that
did.
having an impact on them at this point.
It seems like a lot of companies think it's going to bottom out next quarter.
Ah,
And then it will rebound. But then the memory companies, when they were announcing their earnings, like Samsung announced like, you know, 50x profit on their memory business. Um, and, you know, SK Hynix is giving their employees a $500,000 bonuses. Um, but I think memory will, sorry, to get to the point, they said the memory company said that they believe that this will continue into 27 and potentially beyond in terms of shortage. But I also think that there are going to be things people do to figure out how to resolve the challenges with memory and minimizing memory use when possible, and you know, changing pricing, and you know, killing SKUs that don't make sense in the meantime. Qualcomm seemed to be the one who talked about it the most. Um, but I would also say that like no one really wants to talk about it too much. They want to just like hope that it goes away. And then if it impacts earnings, then they talk about it. But I do think I want to point one funny thing that happened during the Apple call. One of the analysts who was asking questions asked mentioned or asked a question about agentic phones and said like, you know, agentic phones, whatever that means, because agentic phones are a thing, I guess, but really nobody really knows what that means. But I think, you know, on the Qualcomm call, you know, they were asked about stuff like OpenAI, and it sounded like they were basically confirming that yes, they are building AI, a phone, you know, so working with OpenAI to build a phone, and that they're not the only ones. So, you know, things are happening pretty fast. I do think it's funny that smartphones are becoming an area of focus. We talked about it last week, but this is almost like a confirmation that this is happening. And yeah, you know, it doesn't hurt for Qualcomm to be the silicon partner for OpenAI, but OpenAI also clearly knows that having one silicon partner is not necessarily the best in terms of, you know, negotiating your costs. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out, and I will absolutely be following it.
there we go. All right, stay tuned. I'm excited. Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff in the earnings season this season. So yeah, good. So I'm going to pivot to my second topic, and it's a pretty short one. It's really just a scene setter for next week. So you and I talked about, you know, May is a really busy month. Well, my first trip in May is next week. I'll be headed to the Wireless Infrastructure Association's Connect X trade show. which in my mind is my second favorite trade show of the year, just behind the Mobile World Congress show that happens every year in Barcelona. But I really like the ConnectX show. It's mainly a a trade show for the cell tower industry. So cell tower operators like SBA and Crown Castle, they're the ones who are the main audience at this show. And so when you go to this kind of a show, you really get a sense of like, you know, who's climbing towers, who's installing what equipment, you know, what's actually happening at the network level. You really get a very hands-on feel for the wireless industry sort of at a ground level. You know, when you go to Mobile World Congress, you hear about AI native and autonomous networks, and you know, it can feel very PowerPoint vaporware type stuff. But when you go to WIA, you get a sense of like, well, you know, this person's climbing a tower and installing this much equipment, and this equipment does this, you know, so it's a lot more hands-on. So I appreciate that show. And in advance of the show, I published as a scene setter for that show, I published an article called "The Hardest Working Cell Tower in Miami." Because the trade show happens in the greater, this ConnectX next week happens in the greater Miami metro area. And so we looked through all the Ookla data, found the cell tower that looks like it's working the hardest, essentially the cell tower where there's a lot of tests and a lot or a degradation in speeds. And so essentially looked at the of the 3,000 cell towers in the greater Miami area. We looked at to find the one that had the greatest slowdown and the largest load in terms of number of tests. Not surprisingly, it's near the airport. Shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who knows how wireless networks work, right? Airport networks and airports do a lot of heavy lifting all day long, every day. So it's not a surprise that the cell tower is there. But anyway, it's just a fun little article as a scene setter for the ConnectX show, and I'll be there next week. So next time you and I talk, I'll give you the full download on that'll be my first talking point, I'm sure, is takeaways from ConnectX. It's a good trade show. It's a fun time.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting article. I also thought it was interesting that it's like the slowest between 7 and 9 p.m., which is interesting. I feel like that would be like more like restaurant business hours of busyness. But I guess maybe there's a lot of flights that time. And yeah, I mean, it makes sense if there's a cell tower near the airport, it's probably pinging a lot of people in planes or at the airport itself, which is a lot of people. And there probably aren't enough cell sites in the area because they probably can't deploy as many as they'd like to due to interference mitigation, and you know, siting is probably difficult in the area. So I imagine this tower is, you know, the little tower that could, because it doesn't have a choice.
I'm sorry I missed that. I wish you had suggested that. That's an even better headline. That's good stuff. Yep.
But yeah,
That's
I guess
cool, yeah.
the one question I had is like, I assume when you looked at the data, you were looking at all three carriers
Yes.
as using the same cell site.
Correct. So within the Euclid data, you can start sifting as to, you know, exactly which provider is operating where, and then, you know, on the tower ownership side, there's towers that are owned by third parties. There's towers that are owned by the carriers themselves, and in many cases, we can see that data as well. In this case, we used cell site location information that is essentially determined by the signal strength. But we also have a database that is literally the, you know, where the cell towers are registered. In many cases, they are registered with the FCC. So there's ways to look at to look at all that stuff. But yeah, for this article, we kind of kept it general and just looked at sort of all operators, all cell towers, and then the speeds the aggregate speeds that you can see.
Very cool. I enjoy when you inject Ookla data into our podcast because it's always fun to discuss.
I know. Every once in a while, we get some really interesting insights, and so yeah, and that's just a fun one. I think that's hardest working cell tower, or the little cell tower that could.
I'll move on to my third and final topic, and this one actually happened, I think, yesterday, right after I got back from a event in Seattle. Nokia sold their FWA business to Inseego. I can't say that I saw this coming, but it's also not entirely surprising considering how Nokia has a tendency to do these things. I think this is Nokia trying to focus a little more on what they're doing. And I don't think they want to be in the CPE business, is essentially what this amounts to. Um, and Inseego very much does want to be in the CPE business. So it makes sense that they would do this. Um, and Nokia is pretty vendor agnostic, as is Inseego, so this is kind of a good fit. Not to mention Inseego is very aggressive with deploying their routers and their equipment. Um, the deal is that Nokia will receive $20 million in stock and warrants, equating to a 7% stake in Inseego. So now Nokia is one of Inseego's biggest investors. And Nokia will also make an additional $10 million investment at the close of the transaction, giving Nokia a stake of 11% in Inseego. So that's an interesting transactional situation. Um, and it seems like Inseego's investors are happy because their stock popped 25%, which I think kind of gives them a little bit more of a, um, you know, uh, how do I put this? It gives them a little bit more. They're more equipped to compete with Ericsson, I think. And this being Nokia's former division would be in direct competition with Ericsson's Cradlepoint division, which they no longer call Cradlepoint. There's a few mentions of it here and there, but that's essentially the same equipment that was at the Super Broadband event. So, Inseego and Ericsson were the two providers there, and now it's going to continue to be Inseego and Ericsson. So, yeah, this is just an interesting development because the expectation is that they'll double their revenue as a consequence of this. Inseego is actually a San Diego company, and I know the CEO. He's actually a former Qualcomm exec, Yuho, and it's really interesting because they're going to obviously work with Nokia very closely to continue to move this business forward. And FWA is a big opportunity, and that's kind of Inseego's business. So I think it's a net positive. I do think it does remove some competition from the market, which might impact pricing. But I do think Inseego will be a lot more competitive as a result of this. And yeah, I think that there's some opportunities for Inseego to really bolster their portfolio and right size the products for the customer.
Yeah, yeah, it's been interesting to watch Inseego evolve over the past couple of years, and like you mentioned, with their new CEO and sort of more aggressive footing. And I mean, I feel like this fits in with sort of the new strategy at Nokia, right? Like they're really shedding or moving away from business that they're being very deliberate about what opportunities they want to chase on the Nokia side of things, and it seems like fixed wireless CPE is not one of the things that they want to chase. That was my takeaway of that.
Same.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Cool. So I'll move on to my last one.
Yep.
And naturally, I'll talk a little bit about satellites. One of my favorite things to talk about. Got to hit the satellites. We can't have a podcast without talking at least a little bit about satellites.
Your dog agrees.
Yeah, she does love the satellites. She loves those satellites. Can't get enough.
And barking at them.
And barking at the mailmen and satellites. But yeah, yeah. So just briefly though, is that so my colleague here at Ookla, Luke Kehoe, put out a report on direct-to-device connections in the UK. This follows on our global look at things, but he had a look in the UK specifically, and he found something interesting. It was that the traffic patterns are a little bit different in the UK, mainly because in the UK network coverage is pretty good, right? Like there's a smaller country, certainly cell coverage is quite good in the UK, whereas compared in the US, there's sort of large tracts of wilderness and uncovered no cell signal areas, and in the UK that's a little bit smaller, and as a result, the results that he looked at were it was sort of you see users briefly crossing into not spots, and so as they travel through the UK. So anyway, his findings were interesting, but I thought the real takeaway I thought was some of the satellite commentary that we got from some of the US operators during their quarterly earnings calls. One thing that the new T-Mobile CEO said was that in terms of this direct-to-device, phone to satellite connections, he said we're seeing a lot less usage than we were originally thinking. And I thought that was an interesting comment. The Ookla data that we looked at, it was, about half of 1%, of people were unique users per month were making use of these D2D connections. And so to have the T-Mobile CEO say that, I thought was interesting. But then the real interesting thing was that during these earnings calls, the question also came up, would you be an MVNO provider to Starlink Mobile? And so that was the question that they asked AT&T. That was the question they asked T-Mobile, and the resounding response was no. we do not. Yeah, we do not want to be. We do not want to have a Starlink MVNO on their network. And in fact, our good friend Monica at Fierce Network asked Verizon the same thing. They said, and here's the quote from Verizon. It said, when they're asking about MVNO partners, they said, the partner must provide us with meaningful access to an untapped market segment to expand our customer base or to improve our customer experience. We don't believe an MVNO with Starlink meets those criteria, was the quote from Verizon. So I just think that's pretty interesting. Pretty interesting. I'm not sure what to read into that. I'm reluctant to read too far into it. I think, we've talked about how the D2D market, there's just it's a very small number of active users. I think the prospect of a Starlink Mobile MVNO is certainly interesting, but I'm not convinced it's anything imminent. But yeah, to have all three of the big U.S. mobile network operators specifically say they don't want to ink an MVNO with Starlink it's an interesting development. I think it's a little bit of competitive positioning, and we also obviously have the Starlink IPO coming soon. It has been an interesting industry to watch. This is yet another sort of data point on the board about which way the winds are shifting. So something we'll continue to watch.
Yeah, I thought it was very funny when I saw every carrier one by one go, no, we want nothing to do with the Starlink MVNO. I mean, that tracks. Nobody wants to give up, that kind of control and just be a dumb pipe for somebody else. I mean, they all still offer it, obviously, but they're all trying to do something slightly different, and they're not really offering it to someone like Starlink. So, yeah, not really surprising there, but it is interesting to see that usage is lower than anticipated. What's funny is I actually posted some slides and pictures from the event that I was at, Super Mobile, related to Starlink. One of my friends lives in the Washington State area, but he has a home out in the west side by all the preserves and bays and wilderness. And he said the service out there is actually terrible. And it's not because he doesn't have coverage, it's because everybody's on Starlink. So when everybody's on the same Starlink cell, the performance is actually quite poor, and it drops out at the worst possible times. So it's not, it supports my thesis that I think Starlink and satellite are great for when things are needed. But it's not the end all be all, and it will not be the solution for everyone. And people need to remember that it's good to just know that you need to think about if it's the right fit for you. And if it's your best choice, then obviously go for it. But I think people are a little too hastily trying to use satellite to replace things. And it's no, that doesn't really work. And it won't scale if everybody's on satellite because it's not designed for that. So it'll be really interesting to see how people utilize D2D differently from broadband. But I still think that there's plenty of great opportunities for it. I just don't think it's, something that you should only have as your sole service.
The idea of, there is no silver bullet. It's like WiMAX was originally touted as, the be all end all of networks. And, It's not a silver bullet. Here's satellite. Everything's going to go into satellite. That's not the silver bullet. It really does seem like the future of connectivity is going to be a mix, right? Satellite will play a role, cellular will play a role, fiber will play a role, Wi-Fi will play a role, and so it will be up to each provider to figure out how they're going to mix and match. And I mean, that's the theme of our podcast today, right? Mixing and matching. Who's going to mix and match, and how are those things going to be sold, and what's the price? Yeah, it'd be interesting to watch this mixing and matching over the next months and years.
Yeah, it sounds great, and I think that kind of settles it for us this week. I think we had a good podcast once again. I want to say thanks a lot again for Mike for joining us this week. We're going to work on getting some guests on the podcast in the near future, and stay tuned for that. But we hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone would like to provide insights for a future 6G or 5G topic for our podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Mike is at Mike D. Dano, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week. And don't forget to rate us and subscribe.